Hello, everyone. My name is Bill Coughlin, and welcome to First Person Civil War Podcast, which retells the stories of the soldiers and officers on the ground in the battles of the Civil War. Episode 35 is entitled Second Lieutenant Camille Baquet and the 1st New Jersey at the Battle of the Wilderness, and relies on his book, History of the 1st Brigade, New Jersey Volunteers, from 1861 to 1865, which he published in 1910. Camille Archibald Baquet was born in Burlington, New Jersey in 1842, and was about 18 years old when the Civil War began. Unable to join a New Jersey regiment, Camille Baquet traveled to Philadelphia, where he enlisted into Company I of the 16th Pennsylvania Cavalry on 13 September 1862. Private Baquet and the regiment manned the defenses around Washington, D.C., when in April of 1863, now Sergeant Baquet received a promotion to second lieutenant in Company A of the 1st New Jersey. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd New Jersey Volunteers mustered into service in May of 1861 and formed the core of what became the 1st New Jersey Brigade. Present at First Bull Run, the brigade continued its service within the Army of the Potomac at the 7 Days Battles, Antietam, and Fredericksburg, with Second Lieutenant Baquet in the ranks of the 1st New Jersey at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. As the years passed and the casualties mounted, the 1st New Jersey Brigade maintained state identity, and by May of 1864, it consisted of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 10th, and 15th New Jersey Volunteers, and was the 1st Brigade, commanded by Colonel Henry W. Brown, in Brigadier General Horatio Wright's 1st Division, of Major General John Sedgwick's 6th Corps, of the Army of the Potomac, commanded by Major General George Meade. Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, now commander of all Union armies in the field, planned to advance against the Confederacy in several places in 1864, which included a multi-pronged advance into Virginia. The Army of the Potomac's part in this plan was to fight General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia wherever it may be, and destroy it. Given the importance of this assignment, Lieutenant General Grant accompanied the Army of the Potomac from the spring of 1864 until the end of the war, which meant he was in tactical command. The Army of the Potomac began its march in early May, and Second Lieutenant Baquet provided insight on how permanent this departure was, not only to the 1st New Jersey, but the entire 6th Corps. The exacting inspections, issuing of supplies to the rank and file, and review of the troops gave the assurance of the nearness of the expected campaign. On the 3rd of May, orders were issued to the Corps commanders to break up camp at midnight and to have the troops ready to move before the dawn of the 4th. Long before daylight, the bugles sounded to reveille, and soon after, the call to pack up was blown. In a few minutes, thousands of small fires were aglow, the fuel made up of the bedding and discarded accumulations of winter quarters. By the light of their fires, knapsacks were packed, overcoats and blankets rolled, and coffee made. The 6th Corps crossed the Rapidan River at Germanna Ford and entered a region west of the town of Fredericksburg known as the Wilderness. Characterized by dense woods and undergrowth, the Wilderness was already seen to the Battle of Chancellorsville, fought exactly 1 year prior. By the night of the 4th, Second Lieutenant Baquet and the 1st New Jersey camped about 1 mile south of the ford, in vicinity of Lieutenant General Grant's headquarters. Having just completed a long march, the men of the regiment were tense. Little sleep visited the men, who sat around their small campfires in groups, talking in low tones, smoking, some writing letters by the lights of campfires, and many repacking their knapsacks. The next morning, a collection of rejected luxuries and even comforts were scattered over the campground that would have filled 2 or 3 wagons. Every conceivable thing used by soldiers was to be found there. The men were reluctant to sacrifice their treasures, but one day's march satisfied them. Breakfast was hurried, for the roar of musketry in front told the men that the campaign was opened, and that they would be called upon to do their share. On the morning of 5 May, 1864, elements of the 5th Corps departed the Wilderness Tavern, their camp for the night, and marched west down the Orange Turnpike. Approximately 2 miles down the road, the 5th Corps discovered the Confederate 2nd Corps and immediately engaged. The Battle of the Wilderness had begun. The 6th Corps, minus its 3rd Division, which still guarded Germanna Ford, marched down the Spotswood Road, intending to form on the 5th Corps' right flank. As the 1st New Jersey formed in line of battle, 2nd Lieutenant Baquet noted how difficult it was to move the regiment through the dense foliage. The order to move forward as quickly as possible was passed down the line. A charge could not have been made, as the undergrowth was so dense and the trees so close together that it was impossible to keep formation. The regiments of the brigade had difficulty in keeping in touch with each other, and the 4th Regiment was entirely separated from it. The brigade advanced several hundred yards when it encountered Confederate sharpshooters, which forced the 1st New Jersey Brigade to lay on the ground. The firing from the sharpshooters eventually died down, and the brigade continued its advance. At around noon, the 6th Corps finally located the 5th Corps and extended the line of battle north. Though within range of the Confederates, 2nd Lieutenant Baquet noted that the visibility of the enemy was limited to his immediate front. Some firing was done by the brigade, but as no enemy could be seen, it died down to now and then a shot, as the men fancied they saw moving objects or caught sight of sharpshooters. The line was advanced several times during the day to not only keep the lines intact, but to take advantage of the enemy retiring to secure the abandoned positions. It was only after advancing several hundred paces that dead Confederates were found, indicating where their line had been. During the afternoon, a fresh brigade arrived and relieved the Jerseymen, who took up a reserve position just 30 paces in the rear. Though by 2nd Lieutenant Baquet's account, fighting was rather sparse, but constant, and the 1st New Jersey, alongside the entire brigade, ran low on ammunition. Orders from Colonel Brown to be saving of their cartridges gave the men some uneasiness, as they immediately concluded that reserve ammunition was not at hand. At 5 o'clock, a charge was made by the enemy, not long after the 1st New Jersey Brigade had been relieved. The Confederates came on with great dash and spirit, charging right up to the low breastworks that the Jerseymen had thrown up, and which were on fire in several places. The first line stood their ground firmly and poured a hot fire into the rebel ranks, causing great confusion and disabling many of them. The deadly fight lasted 20 minutes or more, when the enemy, seeing so many of their men killed and wounded, gave way and retired, disappearing in the thicket of the undergrowth. The Jerseymen stood in line, ready to make a rush forward as soon as called upon. Though it held firm, there was an air of tension in the Union line. During the Battle of Chancellorsville, the 6th Corps did not fight in the wilderness, as they were further east around Fredericksburg. But they were fully aware of how the Confederates emerged from the woods on the 11th Corps' right flank and routed them. 2nd Lieutenant Baquet already gave us one clue to the mood of the men the night prior, and on the night of 5 May, it was much worse. At night, it seems as if every twig held a whip-poor-will, a kind of bird, and as if one vied with all the rest in the rapidity of their peculiar call. At 3 o'clock in the morning, while the men were asleep lying on their arms, something caused a part of the line to rise up as one man and rush for the rear. They went 10 or 15 steps and then stopped. They returned immediately to the line and laid down again. No one could explain what caused the stampede, but it was noticed that every man had his rifle, while he left his overcoat, blankets, and knapsack behind. Night combat was rare during the Civil War, but if a regiment stayed on or near the front line, sleeping on your arms was a normal act for soldiers. One must remember that these men just fought for almost an entire day without seeing the lines of the enemy, not to mention the entirety of their own lines. It is no wonder that several men became skittish as night fell. The near-zero visibility during the day now turned to night. If the Confederates chose to attack in the dark, they could also rely on the constant call of hundreds of whip-poor-wills to mask their movements through the dense undergrowth. Given the low visibility of the wilderness, and the fact that 2nd Lieutenant Baquet witnessed this at all, meant that the skittish men probably belonged to the regiment which replaced them during the fight of the day before. It is also assumed that the leadership of this unidentified group of men brought them to a halt, calmed them down, and got them back into line, ready for the second day of fighting. On 6 May, the 3rd Division, which consisted of just 2 brigades, rejoined the 6th Corps after completing its task of guarding Germanna Ford. This division's 2nd Brigade reinforced the brigade north of 2nd Lieutenant Baquet and the 1st New Jersey. Alongside these men came much-needed ammunition wagons, and the Jerseymen fully replenished their cartridge boxes and knapsacks, with approximately 90 rounds per man. Both sides skirmished for most of the day, and it was the sharpshooters that became the most deadly men on the battlefield. 2nd Lieutenant Baquet remained with the main line the entire day, and by that evening, the Union skirmishers finally returned to their lines, with reports of massed Confederates. The brigade was ready to repel the charge, and were looking ahead to fire at the first enemy to come in sight, when a tremendous discharge of musketry on the right of the brigade drew their attention. The weird rebel yell accompanied the discharge, and the men of the 1st Brigade saw a vast crowd of Confederates pouring over the half-built breastworks in front of Seymour's brigade, on which they were at work when the enemy charged. It was said afterward that the pickets were but a few yards in front of their line, and that the brigade had stacked arms and doffed accoutrements to be able to work more effectively on their entrenchments. Brigadier General John B. Gordon managed to scout the right flank of the Union line during the day, and he correctly deduced that his brigade rested on the 6th Corps' right flank. He reported this to his division commander and received permission to advance on this flank with another brigade in support, until he called a halt at dusk. A line of skirmishers covering this flank of the enemy readily gave way, and surprised by this sudden and vigorous attack, the troops on his right deserted their trenches and fled. Repeated efforts were made by brigade commanders to change front and check our advance. These commands were rapidly broken and scattered. The advance of my brigade was steady and uninterrupted until the approach of darkness. Caught up in this Confederate flank attack and unable to stop it was 2nd Lieutenant Baquet and the 1st New Jersey. A wild scramble for the rear ensued, and the rebels, pursuing, kept up a fierce fire upon the retreating troops. Shaler's brigade was struck by the flanking force of Gordon's Confederate brigade, and doubled up on the mass of disorganized regiments of Seymour's brigade. The right of the Jersey brigade was broken and forced back by the stampede, and the men backed off towards the left and rear so as to present as decent a front to the enemy as possible. This line stopped the further advance of Gordon's men, who probably thought they had done enough in capturing 2 Union generals and about 600 men from Seymour's, Shaler's, and the 1st Jersey brigades. The 6th Corps formed a new line further down the Orange Turnpike, and as 2nd Lieutenant Baquet in the 1st New Jersey reached this line, the fighting on the second day ceased. The regiment served on the skirmish line the next day and saw little fighting on this final day of the Battle of the Wilderness, but they had already suffered greatly. Of the total casualties sustained by the New Jersey Brigade, the 1st New Jersey accounted for almost one-half. 17 officers and men died, 106 wounded, and 39 captured. Though not explicitly stated by 2nd Lieutenant Baquet, this means that his regiment was on the right flank of the brigade, which broke and fled to the rear before reforming with the rest of the 6th Corps. The Battle of the Wilderness was inconclusive, and instead of withdrawing his army to rest and refit, Lieutenant General Grant opted to march his army south and east and continue to hammer away at the Army of Northern Virginia. 2nd Lieutenant Baquet remained with the 1st New Jersey through Spotsylvania Courthouse and Cold Harbor, when on 23 June 1864, just one day prior to the official end of the overland campaign around Petersburg, his term of enlistment expired, and he returned to New Jersey. Before ending this episode, I would like to touch on an unintended legacy of the overland campaign. After the Civil War, the U.S. government published the multi-volume series, The War of the Rebellion, a compilation of the official records of the Union and Confederate armies, which has proved one of the most influential sources for historians, as it contains reports not just from the generals after a battle, but all the way down to regimental and artillery battery commanders. But with the Overland Campaign, the reports are sparse and heavily summarized. With each episode, I incorporate a report from the opposing side that mostly corroborates what a soldier or officer wrote in his own book. But these reports require downtime for leadership to gather their thoughts and put pen to paper. This important time after the Battle of the Wilderness and most of the battles of the Overland Campaign was absent, as from 4 May to 24 June 1864, there was constant fighting or marching, and therefore no time to write. This meant that the only source that mentioned the 1st New Jersey was from the division commander, which heavily summarized the fighting, while the only useful Confederate report was that of Brigadier General Gordon and his flank attack. This is why personal accounts like 2nd Lieutenant Baquet's are important to understanding how the Battle of the Wilderness, or any battle of the Civil War, unfolded. 2nd Lieutenant Baquet's book, History of the 1st Brigade, New Jersey Volunteers, from 1861 to 1865, incorporated multiple first-person accounts on the battlefield, as well as the history of all 8 regiments of the brigade. Published in 1910, it was the first comprehensive book about this brigade. The work here presented is intended to fill a space in the history of New Jersey's soldier sons, heretofore neglected. That so long a time has elapsed since the deeds recorded were performed before any record of them was attempted must be attributed to the modesty of the men who made that record on the battlefields of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. This unfortunate modesty has lost the readers of this work many incidents of personal bravery and sacrifice that would have given both interest and charm to it. Thank you for listening to the 35th episode. The link to 2nd Lieutenant Baquet's book is now available on the podcast website, firstpersoncivilwarpodcast.com. On Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn this week, you will find a picture of Camille Baquet and the colors of the 1st New Jersey, alongside other colors from the 1st New Jersey Brigade. In 2 weeks' time, Cadet Frank Preston, Cadet Captain of Company B, Virginia Military Institute Infantry Battalion, provides next episode's first-person account at the Battle of New Market. My name is Bill Coughlin, and thank you for listening to First Person Civil War Podcast.